To fridge or not to fridge? That is the question. All right, gals and pals, so today we're going to answer the age-old question. The question that I've been asked more than any other question probably in my entire 15 plus years in the beverage business, and that is, hey Vino, can I borrow a couple dollars? No, I'm just kidding. Seriously, it is, do I need to chill this or no, and how long if I do, all right? So I'm gonna try my best to break it down for you in a very easy, simplistic way. I don't wanna get too deep into the weeds here. So this is how I'm gonna approach it, okay? Think of alcohol in three different categories. You have wine, beer, and you have spirits, okay? All of these go through a fermentation process. The difference between wine and beer, the difference with wine, beer, and then spirits is that wine and beer end pretty much at the fermentation process. Of course, you have the aging process, but that only really helps to impart flavor. It doesn't change the composition necessarily of the juice. Spirits go through what's called a distillation process. So that actually, what that does, it actually separates the alcohol from all of the other stuff, and therefore it has less of the fruit in it and less of the grain in it. And the reason this matters is because think of an apple. If you cut an apple in half and you leave it out, what starts to happen to it after a while? It turns brown, right? And then you start to wonder if you should eat it or not, right? Because you're like, look at this, it looks like poop.
What's that smell?
But you know, basically that's just the fruit is a live organism and it's reacting to the oxygen, and that's what happens with wine and beer, and that's why wine and beer need to be refrigerated pretty much immediately after being opened. With beer, you should just drink it. I don't know who doesn't finish drinking a beer. But you know, if you're gonna have it, you have to refrigerate it, right? Because you want to do, the cold helps to slow down that oxidation process, okay? Now with spirits though, it's not that blanket of a thing where you'd be like, oh, if it's a spirit, it doesn't need to refrigerate it. Because spirits definitely, they come in different categories, okay? So basically you have what's called fortified wines, you have low ABV liqueurs, you have stuff like aromatized wines, and you also have basically just your regular spirits, like your vodkas and whiskeys and stuff like that, right? So anything, and I'm telling you, anything that is made with wine should be refrigerated.
What are we talking about?
We're talking about vermouths, we're talking about sherries, we're talking about ports, marsala, we're talking about lillet blanc, we're talking about kochi, we're talking about anything that is made with wine should be refrigerated, because ultimately, even though with fortified wines a spirit is added to it, it still has wine in it, which means that it will start to evolve and change when exposed to oxygen, okay? Now, something you should keep in mind with that is that the more empty bottle there is, the less alcohol there is, I guess you could say, the more oxygen is inside the bottle. So even if you put it in the refrigerator, you still want to kind of go ahead and drink that as fast as possible, or use it as fast as possible. That way the oxygen that's in there does not to start to change the composition of the juice, all right? Because ultimately all it is the alcohol that changes, it's the air that changes everything, it's the oxygen. Again, the cold helps to slow that down, but it ultimately doesn't stop it, all right? Now, something that I like to purchase are these little things here, okay? Anything that I buy for cork, whether it's a high proof spirit like whiskey, or it's a vermouth like the Antica here, which comes with a cork, I like to replace the corks with these little seal airtight little, little caps here. I'll put a link to these in the description.
Hi, Billy Mays here.
And what these bad boys do is they're really super duper airtight. They keep any air from leaking in, and I think they're great. And I feel like they personally have done a great job at preserving my bottles really well. All right. Now they have other stuff that's more sophisticated, which actually takes the oxygen out and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily think that's something that you need to invest in. All right. Now, so, and again, anything with wine, you want to make sure you go ahead and refrigerate it, and you want to drink them, within 2 weeks if you want them to, to taste the same.
Excuse me?
Things are getting hotter.
Because it will change over time, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go bad or anything like that. The longer it's in the fridge, maybe, it starts to change color a little bit, and it becomes maybe a little, tastes a little more like damp socks and stuff like that. It's a weird thing to describe, but that's kind of the way it is. It gets a little funky and stuff like that. And that's when you know that maybe it's turned and you want to use it to cook or something like that, all right? But again, use your discretion when you open it up. Use it, put it in the fridge, and every time you use it, give it a sniff test and see if it smells okay. If it smells fine, feel free to use it, all right? Now, in terms of your liqueurs, okay? Liqueurs are an interesting category, right? Because they're not wine-based, but they do come in, sometimes in a very low ABV, okay? Take, for instance, Aperol, okay? Aperol is an Amaro, okay? So an Amaro is basically just a distilled spirit that has some herbs and spices added to it to give it some flavors and stuff, all right? Some of them come very high ABV and some of them come very low ABV, all right? Aperol is, I think, 11%. So do you have to refrigerate it? Excuse me, not necessarily. Yeah, a little burp there, so I was drinking. It doesn't necessarily, right? But the reality is that anything that's low ABV, the other stuff that's in it will start to be affected by oxygen, especially the more oxygen you have in the bottle. So can you leave Aperol out? Sure you can. But what I found, things like Aperol and things like Saint Germain, which is actually 20%, they tend to start to change color a little bit. So the oxygen does start to affect the other ingredients that are inside of it, whether it's the sugar or the flavor components, whatever that's in there, it does start to change it a little bit. Doesn't mean it goes bad like the fortified wines do, but it does start to just look a little different, maybe even taste a little bit different, all right? So my suggestion to you guys is that if you buy something that you don't think you're gonna use a lot, or maybe it's the first time you use it, let's just say something like I don't use Bailey's very often at all, right? And we're gonna talk about cream liqueurs also. I don't use Bailey's very often, so I keep it always in a small bottle. I try to buy 375. If you can even buy the airplane size ones, you go ahead and do that too. Because this is not something I use very often. I only really use it during the holidays, all right? So that way you can run through it a lot faster, okay? Now, getting to cream liqueurs, especially if they're egg-based or if they have any real cream in it, those are something else you want to keep in the fridge, right? Just so that it doesn't start to curdle or go bad, okay? Again, all of this, guys, is just a guide, okay? But now the way you should look at it is any spirit under 15% ABV should probably be kept in the fridge. Not a hard rule unless it's fortified wines, of course. Anything that's wine-based, okay? Anything that's wine-based goes in the fridge no matter what. But in terms of your liqueurs, you want to keep them in the fridge if they're under 15%, just to keep them from being at their best, okay? Not a hard rule, but again, I think for me, it does make a difference to keep some of these in the fridge, all right?
You know, there's some things I forgot to tell you guys, and they're really important.
Now, in terms of keep the shelf life of things like whiskeys and bourbons and and tequilas and stuff like that, a couple things you might want to keep in mind is to keep them out of light.
But you got to keep him out of the sunlight. Sunlight will kill him.
You know, any kind of direct sunlight is usually bad, and keep them away from a heat source, okay? So you don't want to put them right next to your radiators or anything like that, because you know it will affect the spirit. Now, in terms of the shelf life of something like that, you know, again, anything that has anything is affected by oxygen. It's just the strength of oxygen, right? So even whiskey, if you have a bottle of whiskey and you only have a little bit, like for instance, I only have a little bit left with my Japanese whiskey here, right? Now, I've been using it recently, so it's not so bad. It hasn't been like that for a long time, but what I'm gonna do is make sure I just finish that up. You could do something what's called an infinity bottle, where you can put, if you have a bunch of different rums and whiskeys, a bunch of different rums that are low, just put them all into one bottle. Same thing with whiskeys, put them all into one bottle, your vodkas, whatever the case might be. Put them all into one bottle and you have an infinity bottle of rum, infinity bottle of whiskey. My buddy Rob actually made a video. I think he made an infinity whiskey or infinity rum. I'll put a link to that up there. It's just a great way to kind of not waste that stuff and to preserve it in the long run, right, guys? So hopefully you found this video informational. I don't like to get too technical, guys, because I know what I'm doing here, but I don't want to bore you guys with the details. It's just, again, an overall thing for you guys to keep your product as good as possible. That way, when Vino makes another cocktail and you go to crack open something, it doesn't taste like crap. All right, guys? Anyway, I hope you found this video informational. If you did, please press like, please subscribe, and please share with your family and friends. And remember, folks, when life gives you lemons, make yourself a cocktail. Cheers.